Today I'm going to start taking you through one of my favourite plays ever, An Inspector Calls. In school, if you were going through this, it would be like a 6-week course. I'm going to cover all the key things you need to know in just 3 videos, which is quite impressive, if I may say so myself. Pause the video whenever you need to and make sure you take loads of notes. In this lesson, we're going to go through context and all of Act 1. Before reading An Inspector Calls, it's really important for you to have some basic understanding of politics. Because J.B. Priestley, the playwright, was not writing for entertainment. He didn't just sit at home bored one day and decide to write this play for bants. He was definitely writing with purpose, to make his political views heard. Priestley supported the Labour Party. He was a socialist, which means he believed in creating a fair and equal society where poor people get an equal chance of being successful and living a good life. And he thought it was everyone's responsibility to look after each other. So if you had a lot of money and you were rich, then you should share that so that no one struggles. So this play is therefore promoting socialism as a political ideology, but also showing why capitalism, the opposite of socialism, was wrong. Capitalists believed in everyone looking after themselves. If you're born poor, tough. Deal with it. Work harder. Try to make more money. Now, the play is set in 1912. It's set in the Edwardian era, where capitalism was the main ideology. And there was a really strong class system with a huge divide between rich and poor. There was no welfare state, like benefits and pensions. Labour brought that in later. There was no free health, no free schools. All of this was brought in by Labour later. Trade unions didn't exist, so workers couldn't strike in the way that they do now. Again, Labour brought that in much later. 1912 was a very significant year. Firstly, because it was 2 years before World War I. And secondly, it's the year in which the Titanic sank. However, Priestley wrote the play in 1945, so straight after the Second World War, when people had been through so many difficult times, they were feeling completely disillusioned and they were ready for a political change. Capitalism wasn't working for them. Society had been through so much social unrest, poverty and recession, strikes, the emergence of the feminist suffrage movement, the Russian Revolution. People were sick to death, and this feeling really seeps through in Priestley's words throughout the play. So for the first time, the Labour Party won the election. Now, the fact that this play was written in 1945, after 2 world wars, after Titanic, everyone was fed up of all of these tragedies, but it was set in 1912, before any of this happened. This creates dramatic irony. The audience knows more than the characters. The characters in the play have no idea what's about to happen in life. They are clueless about how radically society will change starting in 2 years' time. Yet the audience, watching post-1945, know exactly what went down and how. Priestley was not writing for votes. Labour had already won. He was writing to show people why this change was a great one and why it was necessary for a hopeful future. The play is written in 3 acts with no scene breaks. It's all pretty intense. It starts with a wealthy capitalist Birling family celebrating the engagement of their daughter, Sheila Birling. She is getting engaged to the very elite Gerald Croft. Priestley introduces his characters in the opening stage directions first. The two interesting quotes from the opening stage directions are about the inspector and about Eric. The inspector's significance is emphasized when it says the lighting should be pink and intimate until the inspector arrives, and then it should be brighter and harder. There is so much we can say about this quotation. We can zoom into the pink and intimate, because that really connotes a calm and cozy atmosphere, and it's also fairly romantic. But it also, alternative interpretation, implies that the Birling family prefer their little rose-tinted bubble rather than confront the reality of their privilege. Also, isn't that colour pink really interesting, because you go pink when you blush? So could Priestley be implying that the family has something to be ashamed of that hasn't been revealed yet? Now, when the inspector comes, it forces the Birling family to see the truth. And that's why the lighting goes brighter and harder. They can't hide away anymore. The inspector is going to expose them. Or that lighting serves as a light of interrogation. You know, when you're being interrogated, you're under the spotlight. If we go to a deeper level, it could also be seen as the light of divinity, morality, the light of the truth. Whatever the case, the inspector's mere entrance changes the entire mood of the play, showing his status and his supernatural qualities. Now, Mr. Birling's son, Eric, is described as not quite at ease, half shy, half assertive. There's an interesting repetition of half here, as if Eric is still forming his identity and discovering himself. Later on in this act, Priestley states, Eric suddenly guffaws, his parents look at him. Guffaws means laughs aloud. But there was no joke. No one said a joke, Eric just bursts out laughing randomly. So Priestley uses these stage directions to tell us that there is something strange about Eric. And soon we realize that he is just squiffy. He's an alcoholic. But his parents don't seem to have noticed that, despite all of the obvious clues. Factual details are also given about the family's wealth. They have a maid, Edna, and we learn how Mr. Birling is nouveau riche. He's new money. And his wife is his social superior. So he wasn't always rich. He married a woman who was richer than him to move up in society. Sheila is described as a pretty girl. That's important. I want you to keep that in mind. I'm going to come back to that later. We're at this engagement party, and when the dialogue begins, this opening is dominated by Mr. Birling's long speeches, mainly about himself, but also about why socialists are dumb and capitalists are the best. He is desperate to impress his future son-in-law, Gerald Croft. Wait for this, he even researched which alcohol Gerald's father buys and then bought the same one, which is another example supporting the view that Mr. Birling is simply emulating the upper class rather than actually belonging to that world. Priestley mocks Mr. Birling and his views, like when Mr. Birling says the famous quote about the Titanic being unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. It is clearly written to get the audience to laugh at Mr. Birling, and therefore laugh at the capitalism he represents. If the audience is pitted against Mr. Birling right at the start of the play, they will therefore be pitted against everything Mr. Birling believes in, and therefore they will hate capitalism too. The audience know what Mr. Birling is saying is nonsense. He doesn't know what he's talking about, but as long as there's money involved, he's loving it. He keeps referring really proudly to himself as a hard-headed, practical man of business. And Priestley cleverly uses the hard head as a metaphor for Mr. Birling's foolishness and his ignorance. The alliteration of H, hard-headed, shows how excited Mr. Birling gets when he's talking about himself. He is the ultimate narcissist. But the worst part is Mr. Birling imposes these views in long, rambling, incoherent speeches onto the younger generations. A really great quotation to analyze in your exams is when Mr. Birling tries to impress his son and his son-in-law by exploring the possibility of war. And he says, "You'll hear some people say that war's inevitable. And to that I say, fiddlesticks." Bear in mind, the audience know that wars did happen, but Mr. Birling's use of some people think that, is dismissive. He disregards what some people are saying in favor of I. Oh, they don't know what they're talking about, but this is what I think. His hubris and his arrogance is the problem. But he clearly has no knowledge to back up his views. The dash creates this strong pause, like a sense of anticipation. We're all waiting. He's like, "To that I say," and we're like, "Yeah, what's your view? What have you got for us?" And he follows it with this anticlimactic, nonsensical word, fiddlesticks. The man has no substance, no rational argument to support his predictions. Therefore, his ideologies, like him, are absurd. He declares that a man has to look after himself, dash, and his family too, of course, connoting that in capitalism, even your own family becomes an afterthought. However, it is here when the inspector enters the stage. In fact, the inspector cuts Mr. Birling off. He is the first character who stops Mr. Birling from chatting. The inspector is presented as the antithesis to Mr. Birling. Mr. Birling thinks that socialism is despicable. He says socialists act like we were all mixed up together like bees in a hive, community and all that nonsense. He uses this simile to say socialists are like bees. They're pests, they're dangerous, they're annoying. Do you want to be near a bee? I don't. He doesn't want to be near socialists. But what he fails to see is that bees produce honey, sweetness. We depend on bees for survival. He cannot see the importance and the sweetness of socialism. In complete contrast to that, the inspector is here to enforce the message of social responsibility. He speaks carefully, weightily, in contrast to Mr. Birling's long ramblings. When the inspector speaks, it is honest and it gets straight to the point. He has come to investigate the death of a factory worker, Eva Smith, who used to work for Mr. Birling, but he fired her. She committed suicide, and the inspector says she'd swallowed a lot of strong disinfectant, burnt her insides out, of course. This is really interesting. The disinfectant becomes a powerful symbol of how the proletariat, the working class, the poor people, are treated like dirt in the capitalist society. Eva tries to cleanse herself of her status through death. The inspector's language is graphic and brutal, and immediately Eric gives a very humane response. It says involuntarily, "My God!" And even Sheila manages a great socialist response. She says, "But these girls aren't cheap labor, they're people." Let's compare this to Mr. Birling's immediate reaction. He says, rather impatiently, "Yes, yes, horrid business, but..." He doesn't care. He cannot even fake a moral reaction. The repetition, "yes, yes," shows he is just trying to get this conversation over and done with as quickly as possible. Mr. Birling is devoid of thinking of anything outside of money, profit, and business. To him, even his own daughter's engagement was a transactional deal, because Crofts Limited are both older and bigger than Birling and Company. In fact, when Mr Birling fails to intimidate the inspector using his own status, he then pathetically tries to use Gerald's family's higher reputation. He says, "This is Mr Gerald Croft, the son of Sir George Croft, you know, Crofts Limited." He repeats Croft 3 times. He's so gross, he's disgusting, I hate him. And maybe any normal working class inspector would be scared, but not this one. His name is Goole, Inspector Goole, Goole, which is a homophone for ghoul, like Ghoul. Ooh. He isn't fazed by any worldly class barriers. He doesn't behave like a typical Edwardian inspector. He is ready to take this family on. They are so ingrained in their capitalist ideologies that it's going to take something way beyond human to break them and to make them learn the importance of responsibility and community. During Mr. Birling's interrogation, he continues his callous rejection of any responsibility. He thinks that he had no part to play in Eva Smith's death, even though he confesses that Eva was a good worker too and on the brink of a promotion, but he sacked her because she asked for her and other girls to be paid a little bit higher. She didn't just want her own pay to go up because he offers that to her, but she thinks that actually all these girls should be paid a little bit more so that we can survive. But Mr. Birling says she'd had a lot to say, far too much, so she had to go. The irony. This man has not stopped talking himself at this point, but he's saying she had too much to say. His view of Eva is tainted by his stereotype of the working class. And remember, Eva can come up as an exam question. Don't think because she's dead, she's not going to come up. So look at how other characters describe her and what you learn about her from what other people say. Now, Mr. Birling uses pejoratives like wretched girl and implies that Eva must have moved on to either becoming a criminal or becoming a prostitute. He says, get into trouble, go on the streets, showing his complete disregard and contempt for the underprivileged. By the end of his interrogation, Mr. Birling is a bit ruffled, but he's still not willing to admit that he's done much wrong. Gerald seems to agree with him, which is quite disappointing, Gerald. At this point, Mrs. Birling hasn't revealed too much of herself in Act 1. She tells her husband off for breaking social etiquette. It says, reproachfully, "Arthur, you're not supposed to say such things," because clearly Mr. Birling doesn't fully understand upper class behaviour. And Mrs. Birling also enforces traditional gender roles onto her daughter, Sheila. She says to her, when you're married, you'll realise that men with important work to do, despite the fact that she herself bosses everyone around and doesn't actually adhere to traditional submissive gender stereotypes. So our first impression of Mrs. Birling seems to be that she's a hypocrite. Sheila is arguably the most interesting character in the play. She is introduced as spoilt, superficial, and silly. She says, "Oh, it's wonderful. Look, mummy, isn't it a beauty?" when Gerald gives her a ring. Despite her reservations about her fiancé Gerald, and her thinking, where was he last summer, she still gets hyperbolically excited in this quotation, all because of a ring. She addresses her mother as mummy, another really important point. It shows how childish she is at the beginning of the play. And there are lots of exclamation marks. And she has this childlike desire to impress her mum and gain her mum's approval. And that's cemented through the rhetorical question, isn't it a beauty? It's like she can't form opinions by herself. She says now that she has the ring, she really feels engaged, because it took a ring, something expensive, to make her feel engaged rather than human love or human emotions. However, even just within this first act, more is revealed about Sheila. We find out that once Eva was fired by Mr. Birling, she got a job in a clothes shop. But during Sheila's interrogation, she reveals that she went to the manager of that shop and told him that this girl, Eva, had been very impertinent. At the beginning of the play, Sheila uses the same language as her parents. Impertinent is a word that her mother uses. It means rude. But unlike her father, Sheila does feel remorse. She feels bad that she got her fired. And Sheila's perceptive too. I know she seems all silly, but at the end of Act 1, she confronts Gerald. And she laughs rather hysterically and says about the inspector, "Why, you fool, he knows. Of course he knows. You'll see, you'll see." Sheila may pretend to be all playful and bubbly because that's how patriarchy wants her to be. But she's the first character to realize that the inspector cannot be fooled. And there are signs that Sheila is a lot more intelligent and a lot more aware than we or her family think. One really interesting grade 9 perceptive point about Sheila is that in the beginning stage directions, remember I said she's described as a pretty girl? And when the inspector is talking to the family about Eva, Sheila asks whether Eva was pretty. And the inspector says, yes, she was a pretty girl. Priestley uses the same exact description to describe both girls. They were both pretty girls. Why does Priestley do that? Did he run out of words? No. He uses an identical description to subtly imply that there was no difference between these two girls. The only difference was how much money they were born into. And yet look at the outcome of their lives. The outcome of their lives was so different. One ended with her insides burnt out, and one is sitting chilling, celebrating her engagement party. And that is not fair. And I'm gonna leave you with that thought. That is the end of this video. Make sure you watch the next video to learn about the next bit of An Inspector Calls. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, give it a like, and don't forget to check out all the other videos in this series.